So in this video, I'm going to be ranking the NBA expansion teams from 1980s onwards, which would be past the NBA-ABA merger. To quickly explain the merger, it was the NBA National Basketball Association as well as the ABA American Basketball Association combining, and with that it brought in 4 extra teams, which was the Denver Nuggets, the Indiana Pacers, the New York Nets, who are now known as the Brooklyn Nets, and the San Antonio Spurs. At that point, there were 22 teams in 1976, and since then, there would be 8 new teams to join the NBA. And that's who I'm going to be talking about in this video, starting with the teams in the 80s. So how an expansion team works is an owner or ownership group makes a bid for a team for the NBA to then decide whether they should be in the NBA or not. Once accepted, they get a roster of players through an expansion draft that gives them the opportunity to draft players on other NBA teams. Though due to the rule that every NBA team has the opportunity to protect up to 8 NBA players on their own team from getting drafted, this leads to all expansion teams drafting just a team full of bench players, which is why they start off really bad. And to make it more fair, I'm just going to do the expansion team's first 20 years just because some teams have a lot more history than others. And first, I'm going to talk about the Dallas Mavericks. In the 1980 offseason, Don Carter would win the bid to bring NBA basketball to Dallas, as the Dallas Mavericks are the first expansion team in the NBA-ABA merger. The start of their franchise was rough, as their first-round pick, Kiki Vandeweghe, would refuse to play and demand a trade from the Dallas Mavericks, as later in the season his request would be granted, as he was traded to the Denver Nuggets for 2 first-round picks in the Mavericks' first season, which led to the Mavericks having the worst record in the NBA. The Mavs would quickly become contenders with their 1981 draft picks, Mark Aguirre and Rolando Blackman, where both of them would lead the Mavericks to the playoffs for 5 seasons from 1983 to 1988. And in that time, both players would become 3-time All-Stars, and the Mavs would make it as far as the Western Conference Finals, losing to the Los Angeles Lakers in 7 games in 1988. At this point, the Mavs would reach their peak, and this would kind of cause a start of a rift between the star player Mark Aguirre and the Mavericks, as his bad reputation coming into the league continued on the Mavericks in spurts throughout his stint, and he would get traded to the Detroit Pistons in the 88-89 season, where he would immediately win back-to-back championships with the Pistons. After the 1990 season, where the Mavericks would be eliminated in a sweep to the Portland Trail Blazers, this would be where the decline of the Mavericks began, as Sam Perkins would be the first starter to leave, signing with the Los Angeles Lakers in that same offseason, and later in seasons to come, Rolando Blackman and the rest of the stars would all be traded, as the Mavs would fall in the standings over the next few years and once again become a lottery team. Though the next few seasons would be tough for the Mavericks, as they would go a combined 46 and 200 from 1991 to 94. To put that in perspective, in the 1993-94 season, nearly half of the NBA would have a better record than the Mavs did in those past 3 seasons. But in those years, the Mavs were able to get young talented players in the NBA draft, selecting Jim Jackson, Jamal Mashburn, as well as Hall of Famer Jason Kidd, but it would only last 2 full seasons, as the trio would get in each other's way more than anything else. And though they all played well stats-wise in their limited time together, that didn't really help the team win games. Fortune would soon change again, as the Mavericks, after a couple of bad seasons, were moved from the trio of Kidd, Mashburn, and Jackson, and now under new head coach Don Nelson, who would also serve as the GM at the time. The Mavericks would go into the 98 draft and trade for a young international project and 9th overall pick Dirk Nowitzki. And later that night, the Mavericks would acquire another very important player in Steve Nash, where at the time he was only a backup point guard, but in the years to come he would end up being a starter and hold a very valuable role for the Mavericks. So with the core of Dirk Nowitzki, Steve Nash, and all-star Michael Finley that was acquired in the earlier mentioned Jason Kidd trade back in 96, the Mavericks would end their 10-year playoff drought in the 2000-2001 season, winning 53 games and ending up as the 5th seed in the Western Conference. The Mavericks would win their first playoff series since the 88 season, beating the Utah Jazz in the first round, but after advancing past the first round, they would lose in the semifinals to the San Antonio Spurs in 5 games. The Mavericks did a very good job in the start of their expansion, making the playoffs in their 4th year, as well as making it 5 years in a row, winning playoff series, going as far as the conference finals. But the Mavericks after that would fall off, as they would only make 1 appearance in their next 11 seasons from 1989 to 2000. Though they weren't able to really win in the 90s, they were able to bring some talent to the team, where I'll give them some credit for, with Jason Kidd, Jamal Mashburn, Jimmy Jackson, as well later in the decade with Dirk Nowitzki, Michael Finley, and Steve Nash. And for that, I'm going to give them a C. Now in 1988, 2 more teams would emerge as expansion teams, being the Charlotte Hornets and the Miami Heat. Right now, I'm going to focus on the Charlotte Hornets just because of their confusing history. With the Charlotte Hornets' first 20 seasons, I'm going to include the years after where the Hornets moved from Charlotte to New Orleans, and this will be the Pelicans' history as well, due to the Hornets not having to make a whole new expansion team like the Bobcats that I will later explain in the video. So this expansion team will be the Charlotte Hornets from the 88-89 season all the way up until the New Orleans Hornets in the 07-08 season. In 1988, the Charlotte Hornets expansion team lost early in their first few seasons, but would still have good role players like Muggsy Bogues, Del Curry, and Kendall Gill to build around their eventual first overall pick, UNLV star and NCAA champion Larry Johnson in the 1991 draft, as well as Georgetown star and first-team All-American Alonzo Mourning going 2nd overall in the very next draft in 1992. These two would show their potential quickly, as they would both emerge as 20 and 10 players, as well as Alonzo Mourning averaging 3.5 blocks per game. The Hornets would make their first ever playoff appearance, and they would win in the first round against the Boston Celtics, but later losing into the second round against the New York Knicks. But an injury-riddled 94 season, as well as a first-round loss to a returning Michael Jordan and company, wouldn't help the improvement of the team overall. But with a contract dispute between the Hornets and Alonzo Mourning, this would cause the star center to request a trade, which would soon be granted as he was traded to the Miami Heat for Glenn Rice and a couple of other players. In the season following, they would end up going back into the 500 column with another 41-41 record. Even though the Hornets, with the addition of Rice, had a top 5 offense in the league, their defense fell off a cliff after Alonzo Mourning left the team ranking as the 3rd worst defense in the league. And later in the 96 offseason, the Hornets would begin to shake up their roster by trading their former first overall pick in Larry Johnson to the New York Knicks for Anthony Mason, as well as trading their recently drafted pick and high school sensation Kobe Bryant for Vlade Divac. After the 96 season, the Hornets would make the playoffs 4 out of the next 5 seasons, reaching the semifinals twice, but the roster would shake up a little bit once the 2000s came along, and they had a couple new stars in Baron Davis, their 3rd overall pick in the 99 draft, as well as Jamal Mashburn. But even though the team was still successful in that time, attendance for the Hornets would plummet from being 1st in the league to last in just a couple years due to legal issues with the owner. And in 2002, before they even finished their playoff run, the plan was already set for the Hornets to move from Charlotte to New Orleans. The first season for the Hornets in New Orleans would start in the 02-03 season, and in those first 2 seasons, the Hornets would continue making the playoffs behind 2-time All-Star Baron Davis, as well as an All-Star in Jamal McGlure, where they both played in the 04 All-Star game. Health would be a problem for the Hornets, as Jamal Mashburn, their 2nd leading scorer, would only play 19 games in that 04 season, and the team would later lose their first round series in 7 games to the Miami Heat. These nagging injuries for Jamal Mashburn would continue into the next season, where he would sit out the entire season and later end up retiring in 2005. This would be a big blow for the Hornets, as they would also lose Baron Davis for most of the first half of the 04-05 season, where the Hornets would trade Baron Davis at the 05 trade deadline, and Hornets would later finish the season 18-64 in the 04-05 season. After that messy season, they would go into the 2005 draft, selecting Chris Paul with the 4th overall pick, and he would end up being one of the best players in Hornets' intertwined history of Charlotte and New Orleans at the time. And in the years following, the New Orleans Hornets record would steadily improve, and they would develop their young talent in Chris Paul and 2003 first round pick David West, acquiring players like Peja Stojakovic, who was a veteran sharpshooter for the Hornets, as well as Tyson Chandler, who was acquired from the Chicago Bulls, who would end up being a very good up-and-coming defensive star. The Hornets would end up improving significantly in the 07-08 season, where they would have their most successful season in team history, winning 56 games, as well as Chris Paul and David West being named All-Stars that year, as well as Chris Paul placing second in MVP votes. But the Hornets still couldn't get past the second round, losing to the NBA reigning champion San Antonio Spurs in 7 games. So with the Hornets' multiple runs in the playoffs with varying talents over the 2 decades, I'm going to have to give them a B for the expansion run. Now that I finished talking about Charlotte's first run, now I'm going to go into Charlotte's second run with the expansion of the Charlotte Bobcats. After the Hornets moved to New Orleans, the NBA opened the possibility of Charlotte owning an NBA franchise, provided that they can get a deal on a new arena to be built. Then in 2003, out of several groups that bid for the team, a group led by BET founder Robert L. Johnson was awarded the franchise, which would make Johnson the first African-American majority owner in NBA history. It wouldn't take until later in the 2004 offseason for the franchise to make roster changes, as they would have an expansion draft, with the only notable player drafted being Gerald Wallace. Though they would move up in the draft in 2004, going from the 4th overall pick to the 2nd and drafting NCAA champion Emeka Okafor out of Connecticut. Over the years, the Bobcats would build good defenses around Gerald Wallace, who would end up being on the all-defensive team in the 2000s, as well as Raymond Felton, the Bobcats' 5th overall pick in 2005, would become a quality starting point guard. Then later in the decade, Tyson Chandler, who I mentioned earlier, was a great interior defender that would be acquired from the Hornets for Emeka Okafor, and Steven Jackson, who was an accomplished shooter and NBA champion that was acquired through trades as well. Though they had some good players over the years and good ranked defenses, their offense would always be the problem, as they would have a bottom 5 offensive rating for the first decade of their franchise history. There's a few things to know in the 2000s for the Bobcats. Michael Jordan would buy a minority stake in the team in 2006 that would have Jordan take over basketball operations. He previously controlled basketball operations for the Washington Wizards from 2000 to 2003, where he would infamously draft Kwame Brown as the number 1 pick in 2001, and then later Jordan would become the majority owner for the Bobcats in 2010. These drafting inconsistencies would continue with the Bobcats, as they could not get a solid, impactful player outside of Raymond Felton, though most of their picks were chosen within the lottery in the 2000s. As mentioned earlier, the Bobcats team that would include Wallace, Jackson, Felton, and Chandler would find success in the 2009-2010 season and make the playoffs, having the first-ranked defense in the league, and Gerald Wallace would make an all-star team, averaging a double-double with 18 points, 10 rebounds, and averaging 1.5 steals and a block a game, which is a crazy stat line knowing that he's a 6'7" small forward. The Bobcats would later lose in the first round of the playoffs in 2010 to the Orlando Magic, but after the 2010 season, they would quickly go down in the standings, as they would lose Raymond Felton and Tyson Chandler in the 2010 free agency, and with no good replacement soon after, the rest of their core would leave as well, with Gerald Wallace and Steven Jackson leaving that very next season. The Bobcats would quickly struggle, as their worst stretch of basketball would be in the 2011-2012 season, where due to the lockout and having only 66 total games played that season, the Bobcats would have the worst win percentage in NBA history at 7-59. After the 2012-2013 season, the Charlotte Bobcats would make an effort to become competitive in signing free agent Al Jefferson, where at that point he averaged nearly a double-double for the Utah Jazz, but would increase his numbers for Charlotte, averaging 22 points and 11 rebounds on his way to an All-NBA third selection, as well as a consistent play from their first-round pick from the 2011 draft, Kemba Walker. The Bobcats would make the playoffs in the 2013-2014 season, but they would lose to the Miami Heat in the first round. For the 2014-2015 NBA season, Charlotte would return to their old team name, as New Orleans years earlier would change from the Hornets to the Pelicans, which then Michael Jordan would apply to get the Hornets name back, which was approved. But for the rest of the 2010s as well as early 2020s, the newly renamed Hornets would not improve over this time, as their consistent efforts to retool didn't make the difference, and they would stay in the middle of the pack, which is basically no man's land in the Eastern Conference, only making the playoffs once in the 9 years once they rebranded in the 2014-2015 season. The only thing worthy to note is Kemba Walker's years there, where he would average 20 points and 5.5 assists, making the All-Star team from 2017 to 2019 and winning All-NBA third team in 2019. And due to the Hornets management and their inability to get proper help for Kemba, which led to him leaving in the 2018-2019 season, where he would join the Boston Celtics. Now this current roster for the Hornets in their 20th season includes a young core, LaMelo Ball, who is a young star in the league already making an all-star game, as well as Brandon Miller, who's been an improving rookie over this season, as well as Mark Williams. Though he was hampered by injuries in the Hornets 20th season, he has been a really good player and showed a lot of good flashes throughout this season as well as last season, his rookie year. This young Hornets roster was able to build through the draft and their improved draft habits and tendencies. And now with this young core, though they might not be good for the first few years of rebuilding, they do have the potential of being a really good team in the future with very good players in LaMelo as well as Brandon Miller and Mark Williams. But for Charlotte's second run with the Bobcats, saying they're bad would be an understatement. The Bobcats were awful at drafting, as Kemba Walker was their only star for most of their run as an expansion team. And this was the time where they mostly been losers for their 20 years. So they had a lot of opportunities at draft picks, but they just kept missing. The only positive thing I could say for the Hornets front office is their aggressiveness to sign free agents. But with the rest of their team building, as bad as it was hard to build a consistent playoff team over those years. Yes, but this doesn't change the fact that this Hornets team only had 4 winning seasons and 3 playoff appearances in their first 20 years. This is honestly atrocious. I gotta give these guys an F. Now, for the Miami Heat's first 5 seasons of their expansion, they were very forgettable with a young core that included Heat draft picks Glenn Rice, Steve Smith, and Ronnie Cycli. They would reach the playoffs twice in that span, one time having a subpar record in the 92 season, finishing 38-44 and losing to the champion Chicago Bulls in a sweep. But in their final season with that core, they would find some success, ranking top 5 in offense and making the playoffs with a 42-40 record, where they would lose in a 5-game series against the Atlanta Hawks. Things would change by the end of the 94-95 season, where after Miami finishing with another disappointing record of 32-50, they would hire veteran head coach Pat Riley. Where at that point, Pat Riley coached the Lakers to 4 NBA championships in the 80s, as well as coaching the New York Knicks to an NBA Finals appearance in 1994. But Riley, still being on contract with the New York Knicks, would be traded to the Heat for a first-round pick. Pat Riley would not only be hired as a head coach at the time, but the president as well, making all roster decisions for the franchise. And would immediately make changes, as in the 1995-96 season, he would acquire All-Stars Alonzo Mourning and Tim Hardaway to the Heat, and they would improve to a 42-40 record. But later that season, the Heat would fall in the first round to the 72-10 Chicago Bulls. Pat Riley, as the team president, was continuing to improve the roster by adding such players as veterans P.J. Brown, and would acquire Jamal Mashburn. Jamal Mashburn has been a part of all of the 1980s expansion team, which is kind of crazy in correlation with this video. Then later in the 96-97 season, the Heat would improve to a 61-21 record, marking their best regular season for the franchise so far, and would enter the playoffs as the second seed, later defeating the Orlando Magic in the first round and Pat Riley's former team in the New York Knicks in the second round, but they couldn't get past the decade-dominant Chicago Bulls, losing in 5 games in the Eastern Conference Finals. The next 4 seasons, the Heat would finish the regular season as a top 3 seed in the East, but they would never make it back to the Eastern Conference Finals, only winning 1 series in that time. But their shot at title contenders would come to a halt when Alonzo Mourning, after recently winning a gold medal in the 2000 Summer Olympics with Team USA, would announce he would have a rare kidney disease and he would miss most of the 2000-2001 season, and these health issues would continue for the rest of Mourning's career. But with more disappointing playoff exits in the 2000 season as well as the 2001 season, with the main core of Alonzo Mourning and Tim Hardaway aging and the Miami Heat falling down in the standings overall, they would not make the playoffs for the next 2 seasons in 2002 as well as 2003. Tim Hardaway would soon get traded, with his stats declining as well as Alonzo Mourning having another complication with his kidney disease, and he would sit out the 2001-2002 season before ultimately signing a deal with the New Jersey Nets. The Heat in the 2002-2003 season would drop to 25-57, ranking them as the 3rd worst team in their conference and their lowest mark since Pat Riley was hired. After that season, Pat Riley would relinquish his role as the head coach, primarily focusing on his front office duties as the president. Then in the 2003 NBA draft, the Miami Heat would have the 5th pick in one of the best drafts to date, and they would select Dwayne Wade out of Marquette. With Wade, they would also add Lamar Odom in the offseason, and the Heat would end up improving with Dwayne Wade averaging 16 points as a rookie and making the all-rookie first team, and Lamar Odom averaging 17 points and 10 rebounds in a much improved effort compared to his days as a Clipper. The Heat would reach the playoffs as the 4th seed and win their first round playoff series against the New Orleans Hornets in 7 games, but would later fall to the experienced Indiana Pacers in 6 games. Things were looking great for the Heat, and in the offseason of 04, they would make their biggest move of their franchise to that point.
The Lakers have 2. Bryant to shot!
The Heat would trade for Shaquille O'Neal in a blockbuster offseason move for Lamar Odom, Caron Butler, who was their 2002 first-round pick, Brian Grant, and 2 future picks. This would catapult the Heat into title contenders as a team led by Shaq and Wade, and even Alonzo Mourning returning to the franchise to back up Shaq, which was essential to the team as Shaq was wearing down just a little bit as time went on. The Heat would still finish 59-23, having the best record in the conference and ranking top 10 in both offense and defense. Miami looked poised for their first finals appearance, sweeping the New Jersey Nets and Washington Wizards in the first 2 rounds, but in a tough series against the Detroit Pistons, where the Miami Heat were up 3-2 at one point in the series. The defending champion Detroit Pistons would pull off a big victory in Game 6, where Miami would only score 66 points, which was their lowest point total of the playoff. Miami still had a good chance going into Game 7, but they would still lose, which would mark their best season so far, being 1 game away from the finals. But now going into the 05 offseason, the Heat would go all in, making moves, solidifying their bench as well as their role players in the starting lineup. First acquiring guard Jason Williams and small forward James Posey from the Grizzlies, as well as getting Antoine Walker, that though he was an all-star earlier in his career, started to make his way around as a journeyman, and in this time he would become a great 6-man for the team, as well as signing point guard Gary Payton. Though being the oldest player at the time at 37, he still had a lot of veteran leadership, as well as giving the Heat another option as a defensive player and point guard to facilitate the offense. The Heat would have a rough start with an 11-10 record. Soon thereafter, Stan Van Gundy would resign as head coach, and Pat Riley would step in and return as the head coach to make another push for the finals, ending the season with a 52-30 record and getting the 2nd seed. They would start their playoff run defeating the Chicago Bulls in 6 games in the first round and then the New Jersey Nets in the second round in 5 games. But the real challenge would come up against the reigning Eastern Conference champion Detroit Pistons, where an already tremendous defensive team would also improve their offense. With their new coach Flip Saunders, they would go from a 17th ranked offense the season before to now the 4th best offense. With a starting lineup consisting of 4 All-Stars that season in Chauncey Billups, Richard Hamilton, and big men Rasheed and Ben Wallace, and having the best record in the NBA, the Pistons were primed for their 3rd finals appearance in a row. But Shaq, Wade, and the Heat had other plans. The first 2 games were really close, where the margin of victory was 5 points or less, but in the 4 games after, the margin of victory would skyrocket up to 10 or more points, as after splitting the first 2 games, Miami would win their next 3 of 4 games to advance to the NBA Finals. And now the Heat would be facing another team in their first finals appearance.
Mavericks headed to the NBA Finals for the first time in the 26-year history of the franchise.
To go into a little bit from where I left off with the Dallas Mavericks, Dirk and the Mavericks would make great strides in becoming title contenders. As for the next 5 seasons, from 01 to the 06 season, the Mavericks were ranked first in offense in all but 1 season. And even with a team that was with All-Star point guard Steve Nash, that would later leave in the 04 season, Dallas would still manage without him, as they would replace Nash's scoring with 3-point shooter Jason Terry. Michael Finley, who was also another key piece for that Dallas roster in the early 2000s, would leave the Mavericks a season before their finals appearance. In that last season with Dallas, he would be the 2nd leading scorer, and his contributions would be replaced by the Mavs' 03 first-round pick Josh Howard. That would become a steal for them at the time. And with a veteran in Jerry Stackhouse also contributing, made it a tough squad to beat when their offense is clicking. And there, the finals would be set, Miami and the Dallas Mavericks. The Heat's chances were looking so good at the start of the series, as the Heat's chances weren't looking so good, as they would start off sluggish in the first 2 games, with Dwayne Wade shooting under 40% and Shaq only scoring 5 points in game 2 due to constant pressure and double teams of the Dallas defense. Dallas made a statement win in Game 2, winning by 14, and it seemed all but over for the Miami Heat. Then after Game 2, the Heat would switch their offense from being led by Shaq post-ups to Dwayne Wade initiating the offense with his drives from isolations as well as the pick and roll. The guards for the Mavs were unable to stay in front of Wade, often fouling him to the point where fans would think the series was rigged. But nonetheless, Wade would average around 18 free throws a game from games 3 to 6, as the Mavs couldn't find a counter for Wade, as he would average nearly 35 points, 7 rebounds, and nearly 3 steals a game as he would take over the series, winning the NBA championship for the Miami Heat, as he was awarded Finals MVP. Wade looked to be a superstar in the making throughout this playoff run, and the future was bright for him and the Miami Heat. But in the years after, Miami would take a decline in the 2006-2007 season, dropping down to 44-38, finishing only 4th in the conference, and that was mostly due to injuries from key players, as Dwayne Wade and Shaq would miss significant time. And with a disappointing regular season only finishing 4th, it ended up being even more disappointing, as they would lose their first round matchup against the Chicago Bulls, getting swept. But now in the 2007-2008 NBA season, this would be where the Miami Heat would fall apart completely. The Heat would start 0-5 to the season, as well as have a 15-game losing streak later, but an altercation between Shaq and Pat Riley would be the cause of the breakup between Shaq and the Heat, and he would soon get traded to the Suns for Shawn Marion. The Heat would still fall to his 15-67 record, later receiving the 2nd pick of the draft and them selecting Michael Beasley out of Kansas State. And in the last season of the 20-year expansion of the Heat, they would quickly turn around, as Dwayne Wade would carry the 09 Heat to a 43-39 record, as he would lead the league in scoring, averaging 30 points as well as 5 rebounds and 7 assists a game, leading to him being 3rd in MVP voting, as well as getting an All-NBA first team honor and All-Defensive second team honor. but with only a decent supporting cast of former All-Star Jermaine O'Neal that passed his prime, as well as a rookie Michael Beasley and Mario Chalmers, and rookie head coach Eric Spoelstra, where Pat Riley would step down again to focus on his role as team president, the team wouldn't make any deep run in the playoffs as they would lose in the first round to the Atlanta Hawks in 7 games. Now for the Miami Heat, and I'm not going to lie to you, from start to finish, they have been a great franchise for an expansion team, and it honestly all started with Pat Riley. From day one, Pat Riley was able to bring a winning culture as well as being able to acquire talent throughout his tenure as an executive. So with Miami Heat's consistent success in the playoffs, leading to a finals appearance and a win in the finals, I'm going to give the Miami Heat an S for the expansion run. And with that, I finished the 80s expansion teams, including a little detour in Charlotte in the 2000s, and in the next video, I'm going to be going over the 90s expansion teams. So if you liked the video, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'm out.